Hello and welcome to another Tattered Cover virtual event series. For those of you who do not know, Tattered Cover is the largest independent bookstore in Colorado and one of the largest in America. My name is Adam. I am the director of events for Tattered Cover here in Colorado, and I welcome you all because we have been open for 50 years, and it's due to readers like you out there in the virtual world and then in person when we can be, and writers like our guests tonight who have kept us around for 50 years. Before I go any further, I do want to say that you have closed captioning available if you want it or need it. At the bottom of your YouTube screen, there is a black bar that says CC. That is your closed captioning, again, for those who want it or need it. Tonight's virtual event is one of many we do. We are still doing them, even though some stores are back in person. We are sticking strong, making sure everyone's safe. You can go to tatteredcover.com/event for more virtual event series. We are going to have some limited in-person ones. So if you're in Denver, coming up, we have Peter Heller and Hermione Hobie on the 24th and 26th of this month. So again, if you're in the Denver area, please check those out. Tonight, however, we have a guest who is from Denver, the Denver area in Colorado. We have Tana Wojczuk, who is the author of Lady Romeo. Tanya is a contributing editor at Quinerica and teaches writing at New York University. Her work has appeared in the New York Times Magazine, The New Yorker, Tin House, The Believer, Bomb, Narrative, Vice, and elsewhere. She was a finalist for the Gulf Coast Nonfiction Prize, judged by David Shields. Helene Wurlitzer Foundation Fellow, Tin House Summer Writing Workshop, a Poetry Fellow, a Research Fellow at New York University Global Scholars Program. She received her MFA in nonfiction writing from Columbia University. As a Boulder native, she currently lives in Brooklyn. However, she is in Colorado as we do this virtual event. Her first book, Lady Romeo, The Radical Revolutionary Life of Charlotte Cushman, America's first celebrity, was a finalist for the Merrill Prize National Award for Arts Writing, Publishing Triangle Award, and a Lamba Literary Award. Please welcome Tanya virtually, who will be joining us in Colorado. I'm so excited. Tanya, please join us again.
Hello.
Hello there.
Thanks, Adam. It's great.
I am so excited to have you. For guests out there, Tanya and I have been in communication. We were going to try to do this live. Then we thought, just with everything going on, let's keep all of our friends and family safe. So we are virtually here with Tanya tonight, who wrote Lady Romeo. Lady Romeo, what is this about? I mean, the subtitle kind of tells us, but what should readers know before we go into it?
Yeah. So hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. It's a real pleasure. I'm a huge supporter and fan of the Tattered Cover. I've been going there since I was a little kid. And it's just a wonderful space, and excited for people to be there more in person when it's possible. I'm coming to you from Boulder, from my father's art studio. So I'm really feeling the local vibes. It's really
excited,
great.
Yeah,
I'm really excited. So Lady Romeo is the story of Charlotte Cushman, who was a queer 19th century American actress who became America's first celebrity by focusing mainly on men's roles, which are called the breeches parts. So Hamlet, Macbeth, and in particular Romeo. And she, if you think about her, if you read about her, you'll realize that she was known by everyone that we now know today, but her story has been not only forgotten, but in some ways intentionally erased. So I'm excited, to get her story out to more people.
And you're going to do a little bit of reading for us from the beginning of the book. You said, go ahead and set up the reading and I'll hop off and let you take over, and I'll be back to pick your brain about Lady Romeo.
Okay, great. Just going to read a little bit. This is the prologue, the very beginning of the book. And I don't think there's anything particular to set up. It takes place at the end of Charlotte Cushman's career. The crown was made of pale green laurel, fit for a Caesar, and tied with a white ribbon to symbolize royalty. A handsome young actor carried it on stage on a cushion of purple velvet. Charlotte had chosen a simple dress for the occasion. Now in her late 50s, Charlotte had already spent a lifetime being judged by the press, who found her lantern jaw ugly, but her performances electrifying. One friend said that her mouth was like the Arc de Triomphe, which was both a jibe and a compliment. As she greeted the audience, her large, deep-set gray eyes lit up with pleasure. "She is the rage," wrote one critic. "Gentlemen reproduce the color of her favorite mulberry morning gown in their scarves and cravats. Ladies emulate each other in exactly copying the motion of her hips as she walks the stage," reported the New York Tribune. The press follow her from the first preparatory hem of her entrance to the final movement of her embroidered handkerchief as she soothes the tragedy-startled rouge upon her cheek. It was November 1874, and it felt as though all New York City were crowded into Booth's Theater for Charlotte Cushman's farewell performance. An enormous crystal chandelier presided over the grand room, the beautifully dressed men and women crushed and breathless below. Edwin Booth, who owned the theater, had hung red, white, and blue drapery in honor of Charlotte, the, quote, American Queen of Tragedy. New York's wealthy, famous, and powerful sat in the box seats, crushed against blue velvet, or leaned smoking against Grecian pillars that shone richly with golden gilt. Politicians joined socialites and actors. Governor of New York, John Adams Dix, Governor-elect Samuel Tilden, Mayor Havermeyer, and his successor, William Wickham, who was negotiating with the French over how much their Statue of Liberty should cost New Yorkers. Railroad magnate Cornelius Vanderbilt and Peter Cooper. Above them dangled clinging vines and branches of artificial grapes. Standing on the apron of the stage, Charlotte could see thousands of fans crowding excitedly into every available space in the theater. They stood along the aisles at the back, and in the galleries, they leaned precariously over railings. At a signal from the orchestra, the audience turned their faces up to be beatified. Tonight, Booth's Theater was a place of worship. Charlotte could see the machinery behind the marvel. She could see the musicians watching her from the sunken orchestra pit. She knew that new technologies were in the theater, like a sprinkler system to douse overzealous special effects, hydraulic lifts to move the scenery, electric spotlights. That night, she was bookending her career, performing the same role she made her debut in 40 years earlier, as Lady Macbeth. Throughout her career, she had given Shakespeare's characters new life, keeping Shakespeare himself alive when his work could have become a dead thing on the page. She had become famous for her breeches parts, competing with male actors for men's roles over 4 decades: Macbeth, Cardinal Wolsey, Henry VIII, Hamlet, and especially Romeo. Though often described as mannish, even epicene, Charlotte had dazzled fans of every gender as Romeo in her brilliant red and turquoise tunic and skin-tight leggings with a dagger strapped to her thigh. A professor from New York College read an ode written in Charlotte's honor called Salve Regina, Hail Holy Queen. It was modeled on a hymnal. Shakespeare, the poem began, invoking the god of the theater. Honor to him and to her who stands his grand interpreter, stepped out of this broad page upon the living stage. At the end of the performance, Charlotte left before the applause had died away. She gathered her things, and her maid Sally collected her costume. Then they left the theater through the back door at 23rd Street near 5th Avenue. Edwin Booth had built her a bower of pine branches, sweet and herbaceous, and lithe young actors lit her way with torches. They would have carried her, but she had grown too stout for that. Charlotte climbed into her carriage and collapsed against Emma with relief. Emma Stebbins had been Charlotte's wife in all but name for more than 2 decades, even putting her own promising career as a sculptor on hold to take care of Charlotte in her illness. The press referred to Emma as Charlotte's friend or companion, but they called each other by other names. Early in their courtship, Charlotte began calling Emma her Juliet and signing letters, Your Romeo. To friends, Charlotte referred to herself as the man of the house. Though she and Emma were not, Charlotte admitted, as passionate as they once were. Charlotte had played Romeo to more than one Juliet since they'd been together. They had made homes in 5 cities and several continents, survived war, infidelity, and Charlotte's celebrity. Hopefully, they would now survive Charlotte's fans. Whipped into a frenzy of adulation, the crowd surged against the carriage and almost knocked it over. As the driver urged the horses forward, policemen ran ahead, trying to untangle the snarled traffic. But more people kept arriving, jamming against streetcars, pouring into the road. Charlotte watched in amazement and amusement as several men unharnessed the horses from her carriage and pulled it slowly through the oceanic crowd. All right.
Thank you so much for reading that. And before we went live, you mentioned that this was a great setup for who Lady Romeo is, what this book is all about. My first question is very simple. How did you discover this story? And when did you realize you needed to write about Charlotte Cushman?
Yeah, well, I mean, I grew up going to the Colorado Shakespeare Festival, and fell in love with Shakespeare at an early age, and discovered that there were a lot of women who had played male roles, which are, often the choicest roles in Shakespeare. And when I read about Charlotte Cushman, she was very little known about her, and I really wanted to know how a woman who lived with other women, who was performed as a man both on and off stage, could become this enormous celebrity. So people like Walt Whitman raved about her. Louisa May Alcott had she said, stage struck fit over Charlotte Cushman. Nathaniel Hawthorne, Abraham Lincoln, there are so many people who loved her and wrote about her and raved about her. And it's almost like there's a space that's cut out. That's the shape of Charlotte Cushman in our history. And so I wanted to know, first of all, why she was missing, and also then why she was so famous to begin with.
And then there's been commentary and reviews talking about how there's never before seen research, and how did you go into this, finding more about her, because she seems like someone everyone should know about, but there just didn't seem like a lot out there publicly, at least. What was your research like?
Yeah, I mean, I had numerous people tell me not to try to write this book because there wasn't enough material, right? So it's a combination of things. I went deeply into archives and, in New York and DC and the Folger Shakespeare Library, and went to Italy where she had a female artist commune, and just really tried to track things down, everywhere that I possibly could, when possible, in person. And in Boston, the Houghton Theater Library has a lot of amazing material on 19th century theater. And so what I was trying to do was look at what letters I could dig up, because sometimes when you're writing about someone who is marginalized, their material is not necessarily going to be indexed in the archive, right? There's not going to be a folder necessarily with their name on it. Some places, yes. But in many cases, to find letters, I had to look at all the people that she knew. So creating this sort of spider web, and let's look at Longfellow's letters. And sure enough, there were letters to Charlotte, from Charlotte Cushman to Longfellow in this archive. So I was able to track down things that hadn't, been used before, but then also, really filling in the whole world of America in the 19th century, specifically the theater world, which is, the birth of American culture. I mean, that was it. That was the place you went on a Friday night and a Saturday night and a Sunday night. People went to the theater all the time. So it was also a story about how America started to come into its own in terms of having a culture. And it was much more, sort of diverse and edgy and queer than, people later gave it credit for. And so, these stories are now being rediscovered and retold, which is great.
So that sounds, the research alone sounds obviously like it was a whole career. When did you decide you were going to write this? And then how long did the whole project take, from research to final edits?
Yeah. So, I mean, I love the research. That was that's the fun part, especially you want to keep going and discovering things, because you start to feel like a detective, and it's this whodunit of who got rid of Charlotte Cushman and who was she really, and that can keep going. So I would say because of that, I spent probably about 10 years researching the book. but with the last 5 years being like actively writing the book, because it took a while to collect everything.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I would say 10 years, beginning to end for the most part. Yeah.
And one thing I'm fascinated with in all books, but especially like narrative nonfiction, there's a lot you can do with it, obviously. How did you land on your structure? And I guess briefly explain the structure of the book for readers who may not have read it yet.
Yeah, sure. So one thing about the book that's maybe a little unusual is that, it starts with what I just read. Like it starts with a scene, it dropped, created from the research, a real scene. And then all of the notes and research materials are at the back. Mm-hmm. So essentially I wanted the book to read like a novel. And then for people who are like, where did that come from? How did you get this? They can go to the back of the book and they can actually trace where everything is coming from. But I didn't want the research to announce itself. I wanted you to be able to fall into this story, especially, someone who is not as well known today. I wanted people who hadn't heard of her to still be able to get deep into her story and enjoy that story. The book itself, it was kind of weird to try to structure it because there's so much of her career and yet so little. She's had such a long career and yet there's so little material. And so for you like research geeks like me out there, like I, was going through and like creating these mounds of material and saying, okay, like, yes, she had this like 20-year period, but there's very little material there. So where do I have the big, lumps in the snake, or it swallowed the elephant? And those are the places that became sort of the heart of the book, for the most part. And it's structured like kind of like a 3-act structure, really, where, you have these crises of her life that really dictated how the tension of the book was going to be. So she had many disasters that she overcame, that certainly could have made her quit. Her very first performance as an actress was because she failed as a singer. She was trying to be an opera singer and she went on stage and her voice broke. She was in this giant theater in New Orleans, the St. Charles Theater, and she'd never been in such a huge place. And she tries to fill it with her voice and she totally messes up her voice forever, does like permanent damage to her voice. And so what comes out of that is she becomes an actress. Her father abandoned their family, leaving them with massive debts. And she was the eldest. And so she had to go to work. And so she went on the stage. So, there's these disasters that then she turns into opportunities for herself over and over again in her life. And so that also was a big part of the structuring the story of the book. Yeah.
Part of what you said earlier was like, why did why did she disappear from the public or from history? Is there a reason why, like, other than, the queerness of it all? Like, because that seems like an obvious answer. Is there more to it?
Yeah. So a few things. So one of the big things is just the nature of theater and trying to write about theater. So I have a friend who describes this as like Michelangelo's snowman, where there's this beautiful thing that's created and it's just ephemeral. It's going to melt. And that's one of the remarkable things about the theater is you're having this one of a kind experience with other people in that, in that state, in that theater. But you can't really remember it or capture it later. Even film doesn't really capture it, when you try to document it. So theater is ephemeral. And so it lives in the memories of those who actually saw the performances, right? And it relies on those people to write that down. But what ended up happening is, after the Civil War, America became much more conservative, much more quote unquote Victorian, even though Victoria was in England. And the culture really contracted, right? And so in this contraction is when Cushman is leaving the stage and she ultimately retires in 1974, but there's this whole process that's happening of erasure, of trying to get rid of these inconvenient parts of American history. And on the day she dies, there's like rave like obituaries, like no one will ever, will never see one like her. She's amazing, all over the world.
Yeah.
And yet at the exact same time, there's also obituaries saying she was too masculine. She competed with men in an obscene way. Thankfully, like no woman will debase herself by playing men on stage again. So you can see it even in like the days after she died, where there's a competing narrative and this attempt to rewrite history. And that is what ultimately succeeds, in part because of the shift in the culture into like more Victorian moralizing. Mm-hmm. And so the historians who were responsible for recording her story, who knew who would have seen her when she was alive, did not, for the most part. And so what we don't have is like a really robust, series of biographies that came out about her like after she died, right? Yeah. Like we have of Dickens. We have so many books that came out after Dickens died. And she was as famous as Dickens, it's they're like the same number of people, 10,000 or so people had a candlelight vigil for her when she died, and about the same number for Dickens. So those historians didn't record her, but what we do have are private letters where people wrote about her. Elizabeth Barrett Browning writing about meeting her and her then partner in France, in Paris, and we have this private narrative that comes out of it. So in Browning's letter, for example, she writes to her sister, Cushman and, her partner, this woman, Matilda Hayes, who's a writer, they go everywhere together and they dress alike and they're married. They seem to be married. Are they married? Basically. And so it was recognized that she was a lesbian. And she also, thought of herself, often in letters referred to herself more as a man and sometimes dressed as a man. And so that material does survive. There's just not a lot of it. So you have to really dig into the private record to find evidence of who she really was, and that people recognized that in her. It wasn't a total secret.
Yes, and so she died in 1876, and your book came out, in the 2000s and like the 21st century. Were there people trying to keep her name in the public eye? Like, were there other historians between her death and you?
Yeah. I mean, there's not an unbroken line, is what I'm saying. So the people, her contemporaries, did not record her. Big volumes came out about the history of Shakespeare right after she died, and she's missing. So, which is notable. But yeah, so in the 1970s, there was the first biography of her, but it actually didn't mention her queerness at all. It's kind of interesting the way it moves around that. It's very, very interesting. But did do some really excellent research. I found the research notes for that book in an archive in New York, and great. I could piggyback on some of that. It's awesome. And then there was a really wonderful, like, deep dive academic biography by Lisa Merrill that came out in the 1990s, and that's like really like the basis of like contemporary scholarship about Charlotte Cushman. That's where it really starts, because Merrill was the one who went in and like discovered these more private letters of her relationships with these other women that were quite passionate. So in her introduction to that book, Merrill writes, like, I haven't really focused as much on Charlotte's career or Cushman's career. Like, I hope someone will come along and do that. And I was like, that's me. I want to do that, because I wanted to look at her as an actress, look at her career as a professional, and what she try to recreate as a dramaturge, which I have some background in dramaturgy, like what she actually did on the stage that affected people so deeply. So that was an exciting part of the detective work for me.
Yeah, and I always feel I talked about like the structure of like, how you decided to structure it, and I guess let's talk about like why you focused on what you focused on. You just touched upon it. Was there any way this book could have gone that like you maybe started down that path before you realized I need to focus elsewhere?
I don't know. I mean, I definitely had things I hoped to find that I didn't find.
Sure.
So yeah, I mean, I made certain plans around certain things that I thought I would find and didn't find.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I think there is a scholar right now working on a book just about this artist colony in Italy,
Uh,
which there were many. It's sort of, I think it's going to be like a group biography because there were many really amazing artists, including Emma Stebbins, who created the Bethesda Fountain, who is Charlotte's, life partner. Yeah, so I think that'll be great. I'm excited about that.
Yeah.
But there were definitely like moments like that or eras like that could certainly have been an entire book.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. That's why I find it interesting, because I feel like there are these books out there that are these, door stopper. This is the definitive biography, but that's not really interests me. It's more of like, this is a story about someone, and it focuses on a very specific time or a line through their life. We recently had Anne Hagedorn on, who wrote a biography about a Russian spy, and she talked about not planning her book, just sketching where the book might go. What is your outline like? Do you just follow the story? What is your process like? 'Cause I'm a nerd for process.
Yeah, I love these questions. It's making me so happy. You have no idea. I love to outline. I would so much rather outline than write most of the time. Because it's full of possibility, right? It can be anything until you actually sit down to write it and commit. Anyway, that's a whole other thing. So lots of outlining, physically on sketch pads, drawing things out and writing things out. I also use index cards a lot. I mean, I think they are a wonderful way to keep things fluid until you've really figured out what the structure is. So for me, I would put either like really important quotes that I was going to build something around, or details that could become a scene. And eventually, if I had a big enough stack of these details from this performance or this particular time, I knew that I could get a scene out of that, because you have to build it from too many different places. So index cards, and they were sort of in different piles of those different themes. And then also really like a lot of free writing. I mean, outlining is really awesome, but it can sometimes be, you can get stuck at, I found myself making the same outlines over and over again, and wondering why they weren't working. And so just barfing onto the page, like free writing, really helped me figure out what the compelling tensions were going to be. So rather than thinking about it topically or chronologically, thinking about it in terms of what were the really important crossroads that she came to, where her life could have really gone somewhere else. And I really wanted to fight against that sort of narrative of an inevitability that you get sometimes, especially with famous people, they were a star from birth and I wanted to actually show that as a woman, as a fatherless girl, first of all, in the 19th century, who was masculine, ambitious, incredibly talented, there were a lot of ways that her life could have been different and could have never gone on the stage. She could have ended up, as someone's governess or as a seamstress, or she could have ended up as a prostitute, which is what happened to a huge percentage of poor women who moved to cities, especially in the 19th century. And my sense in reading about that time period and what women were, how they were constrained, is that was a huge fear hanging over her head. And when she was cast as the prostitute Nancy in in Dickens' Oliver Twist, she was so pissed because she was worried that the critics were going to associate her with prostitution. So there's some interesting ways of approaching this that doesn't have to be like a fairy tale. I want to resist that fairy tale, because her life could come across that way for sure if you didn't see all the actual choices she made and how it's more of a psychological biography in that way, because her character really dictated the choices that she made. And that's why she ended up where she ended up, I think. I mean, plus obviously she was white. She was privileged in some ways, even though she didn't have money. She was kind of found this niche for herself early. So there's also like compelling outside factors that helped her get where she got to.
Definitely. And I have a few more questions, but I just want everyone out there watching, if you have questions for Tanya, please put them in the YouTube chat, and we'll get to them in a second. One thing about your book, it's, you know, it reads like a novel. It's like it's very narrative. How, and you talked about like the 3-act structure and it hitting those beats. How much was like the emotional journey for readers on your mind as you were writing?
Yeah, a lot. I mean, I was having an emotional journey also writing about it. I wanted people to understand that that there were real dangers here. In part prostitution, you know, but also just the dangers of failure. And I think what's interesting about Cushman is that she failed a lot, actually. And I think that for me, that was part of the emotional narrative, not just like triumphing over failure, but just failing again and again. And even though she didn't have a financial safety net, she had other safety nets. And she also had, tremendous, it's kind of a cliche, but this tremendous work ethic, this sort of puritanical self-denying work ethic that kept her going also.
Definitely. And we had our first question come in from Mary, who asked, when it comes to research, where do you start? Like, not maybe for Lady Romeo, but just in general, what is your research method for when you gotta start somewhere, right?
So for me, I want to have a question, because if I have a topic, I'm never going to finish. And I'm also going to lose interest. I think I've had a lot of projects where I start research on a topic and then I never do anything with it because it doesn't have tension or narrative drive. So coming up with a series of questions that you want to answer in your research, and obviously those questions might change as you begin the research. And really, whenever possible, if you're doing, more historical research, looking at primary material, like looking at letters, archives, steering clear of Google as much as possible, at least initially. I think I made my life a lot harder by not reading the secondary sources first and seeing what was already done. But I also was a little bit anxious about not being overly influenced by other people's vision of her. So I really personally wanted to focus on reading her letters and hearing her voice before I looked at, what other people said about her.
And that was a question I actually had, and I'm glad you re-brought it up. The idea of, the primary sources, obviously the letters, everything, but how much did you, like those two biography and memoirs, you mentioned how you piggybacked off their research because you found the archives, but did you read those a lot, the actual books? Did you read them once and just kind of put them aside? Like, what were they like for you?
I didn't read them a lot. I had a very different angle than both of those pieces. So I actually read them later on after I had been in the archives and read her letters. And I should back up for a second. So I knew where those letters were because Lisa Merrill wrote her book, right? That's really important. But I flipped to the end of her book first and looked at where are the archives? What's there? And I started there. And then I went back and read and looked at how she had approached the subject and knew that and that's when I actually realized that I wanted to write a book because there was a gap, right? There was which in every book, there's going to be a gap, and looking for, there's actually a hole in the research that invites me in, that makes me want to fill that in. That's compelling and exciting. So I read it a little bit later on, but once I did, I knew that I could write a book about her, that I had something else to say.
And we have another question that came in from Trudy, who says, is Cushman similar to Gentleman Jack in lifestyle and a place in history? I
love Gentleman Jack. So it's so funny because I came across some of that material researching Cushman. And I was like, oh, this would make a great book. And then like, it's out, it's happened. She was not similar to Gentleman Jack because to Lister, because she was not a like wealthy landowner, and she was a she was like a celebrity. She was like a public facing persona. So they had very different lives in that way. But I think the way that Anne Lister is portrayed, certainly in the film, as this sort of rogue and like, you know, she's a seducer, and she, you know, I think they have that in common. Cushman had many lovers as well as partners. She always had, you know, a main life partner, but she did have affairs, especially with young actresses. And I do think there's this element of like, you know, being the cavalier and like, you know, it was very attractive to women. And I think that that's something that some DNA that they definitely share.
Yeah. And then a question from Donald is just more about your like essay writing, and you've written a lot of essays. You were a finalist for the Gulf Coast Nonfiction Prize. Where do those ideas come from? Why are you writing what you're writing, you know, outside of Lady Romeo?
Yeah. I love essays. I love writing essays. It's such a unique form. There's so many different kinds of essays. Mm-hmm. Really cool. You can write scenes, you can write lyric essays that are more poetic, you can break up structure, you can write a personal narrative. I mean, there's just like all kinds of experimental cool stuff you can do, which excites me. And some parts of this book are definitely more essayistic. Some parts are very like novelistic and scenes, and then I wanted to pull out occasionally and just look at sort of what kind of argument do I want to make about, you know, why she was forgotten or why she was famous in the first place. But yeah, so, and I, you know, in terms of writing essays, also, again, like just really focusing on questions. Like an essay has to really focus on a question or a series of questions. You know, even if it's lyric, even if it's more poetic, there's some kind of thing that a tension or problem that the writer's trying to figure out. Mm-hmm. And I really believe that like writing is a way for us to think better, and also, you know, to help, you know, think through some of these problems together, which is also, mm-hmm. I think, an important function of literature right now.
Mm-hmm. And I'll piggyback off that. I always ask writers this, especially nonfiction writers. They usually dodge it, but I'll ask you anyway. What interests you down the line? What may you write a full book about moving forward? You don't have to tell me what you're working on, just like what interests you.
Yeah. I mean, I'm interested in continuing to write biography. I really take to that form. I wrote a lot of essayistic like profiles before writing this book. I didn't really realize I was writing biographies until much later. You know, the story of someone's life and like why I guess I'm really interested in like how people ended up where they ended up and what choices they made, and also like what happened in the world that drove them there. I'm reading an excellent biography right now that just came out by Rebecca Donner. It's called All the Frequent Troubles of Our Days. And it's about, you know, her, I think, aunt or great aunt, who was she fought back against the Nazis sort of in these underground ways. And, you know, she was killed. Ultimately, she was executed. But it's a really a great book about like how we ended up with Hitler, but also how this woman, Mildred Harnack, fought back. And I think that's what interests me is like, what is it in someone's personality or upbringing or circumstances that gives them the life that they have? I mean, it's just endlessly fascinating. So yeah, so more biography. I'm really, you know, I took 10 years to write about the 19th century, so I may continue writing about, you know, women in the 19th century. But that's as much as I want to reveal.
Of course. Yeah. We have two more audience questions. One that I really like, this one from Alexander. If you were a casting director, who would you tap to play Charlotte Cushman in a movie about?
Yes. So Oh boy, there's a lot of people who could play this really well. I don't know, I always think about Glenn Close, even though, Cushman had a really long career, and you could certainly play her as a younger actress and get a lot out of that. But I also think that it would be an incredible role for an older actress, because there aren't that many of those. And she did a lot in the latter half of her career. That's really exciting.
Yeah, definitely. Glenn Close should be in more things anyway.
I know, she's incredible.
Yeah. And then the last audience question is from Trudy again. Did your initial impression of Charlotte change over time with your research, and did this change your perception of the theater during that time period?
Yeah, such a good question. So some things I realized about Charlotte Cushman. She was not a good girlfriend, let's put it that way. Okay. She was incredibly driven, ambitious. As I said, she worked through cancer and intense pain. She worked almost every day of her life, performing. But at home, I think she really either expected or allowed her partners to just be the homemaker, and fell into these sort of more traditional gender roles. She tended to partner with women who are really talented. The translator of George Sand, Emma Stebbins, who's obviously this sculptor of the Bethesda Fountain, other talented women. And then they would give up their careers for like decades to follow her around on tour, which is quite unfair. And we don't have as much work from these women as a result. So it's an interesting downside in a way to sort of how she treated her relationships. And, she brought another woman into her relationship towards the end, who she then married to her nephew, this 19-year-old actress, who became her heir. So she gave this woman her name essentially by marrying her into the family, which I think, that's what she wanted. But her Emma Stebbins, her partner, was devastated. It was not an easy thing. And she was quite stoic. I think I looked more for like that 19th century, Victorian flowery language in her letters. It's not like that. She was actually quite, even in her private letters, quite stoic for the most part. And in terms of the theater, the theater, as you might imagine, was a chaotic place. It could be a dangerous place, a lot of substance abuse, as you also might imagine. But it was also a community of people who would have been outcasts, elsewhere. And I was interested to see also in the theater, I knew it was the main entertainment of the 19th century. I didn't realize just how huge it was and how often people went. And what an important role it had in people's lives and in public discourse. So that was really cool. That was one of the big rewards of the research, I think.
Definitely. Well, Tanya, thank you so much for joining Tattered Cover virtually. One day we'll do this in person. Where can readers find you? What website? What do we tweet you? Where do we find you at?
Yeah. So I have a website, tanawojczuk.com, but more likely to update things on Instagram or Twitter, and it's just under my name, so I'm easy to find. Yeah. And obviously if you want to order the book, go through the Tattered Cover.
Yes, I linked it in the show notes. Tana, thank you. Yes, again, this was lovely, and I learned so much just from this talk, and I have yet to finish the book because I always try to not finish it so I could ask questions still. So I can't wait to dive into it tonight. And then and so everyone out there, please, thank you for coming and visiting Tattered Cover virtually. We will see you virtually next time. Everyone have a safe night. Thank you.
Good night.
And we are